Once Franklin Roosevelt is elected president, of course, there's a delay, and then he will be inaugurated in 1933, and he has to get his priorities right. Well, the first thing he does when he's inaugurated is give a speech, and he understands the importance of this speech because this speech is going to set the tone for his presidency. And one of the things he wants to do is, alleviate the fears of people, try to give them hope. And of course, in this speech, which was heard, all over the country over the radio, he has his famous line, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself." And what he's trying to say is that it's the fear, that causes the bank runs. It's the fear that keeps people from doing what needs to be done. So he said, just don't fear. We've got it under control. And of course, if you ever listen to that speech, he has this very deep voice that's very soothing in a lot of ways. And one of the first things he does in his first 100 days, which is kind of, nowadays they call that the presidential honeymoon. After you're first elected, you have about 3 months or so to where you can really get a lot of your policies passed. And nowadays it's called the honeymoon, but he was the first one really to take advantage of it. The first thing he did was to call for a bank holiday, because he understood that one of the major problems was people's distrust of banks, and because they failed and a lot of people lost their money. So what banks were still open, he demanded that they close for, I believe it was 4 days. So all banks had closed for 4 days, and he sent auditors out throughout the country to these banks to check their books to see how stable they were, to see if they were on the verge of going under or failing. And those that were considered safe, he opened them back up. And this alleviated some fear. It gave people hope and some reason to believe that the banks would not fail them. So, and the goal was to make sure that people either kept their money in the bank or put what money they had back into the bank. And this begins to restore a little bit of faith in the economic system. So this is part of just the real early recovery. A lot of it's just psychological. Long-term recovery, the number one goal of the New Deal was to put people to work, because that was the biggest problem of the Depression. And what caused the Depression was unemployment. People just didn't have jobs. When people don't have jobs, they don't have money. And if you don't have money, you don't buy anything. And if there's nobody to buy anything, then companies cannot form. Companies cannot survive. So the goal was to put money in the hands of consumers. To do that, the only entity that can create money, because businesses can't hire people unless there's somebody to buy something. And consumers can't buy anything unless they have money. Well, the only people, or the only entity that can put money in the hands of consumers without those consumers, without businesses providing those jobs, is government. Because government can print money. They can borrow money. So Roosevelt's goal was to use the power of the government and the finances of the government to put people to work, to hire businesses, pay those businesses money out of the government to put people to work, because that's the only way that businesses would be able to form. Now, these corporations that were being put to work, it needed something to do, and the goal of Roosevelt was for them to, at least if they're going to use government money to put people to work, do things that were beneficial to society as a whole. And one of the first things that was established was something called the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley is an area, and I'm going to switch to a map here. This area here around Tennessee, Kentucky, northern Alabama, North Carolina, Virginia, that was, in a lot of ways, it's called Appalachia, especially the North Carolina area and the southern Virginia area. It's called Appalachia. And historically, it's been a very poor area and kind of backwards in a lot of ways. Well, the goal of the Tennessee Valley Authority was to build dams in these areas, because as you can see in the map, there's a lot of rivers. And to build dams in these areas, now, what purpose does that, long-term purpose does that do? Well, they create these dams to build hydroelectric plants, electricity produced by water, and within these dams, hydroelectric plants. Because these areas, as I mentioned, were backwards, and while the rest of the country, or at least large swaths of the country, had electricity, there was still no electricity in most parts of this Tennessee Valley. So two things were happening here. Two good things. One, that the money put into building of these dams required lots of workers. So people were being employed, and that puts money in the hands of consumers. Secondly, that this area was being provided with electricity, which brought them into the modern era, which eventually will allow them to compete economically with the rest of the country, which means jobs. So short-term jobs building the dam, long-term jobs being provided because of the access to electricity. So the Tennessee Valley Authority, Electricity of the Tennessee Valley, funded by the government through construction corporations to hire people and put money in people's hands to spend. Now, once these people have money in their hands from working in for the Tennessee Valley Authority, they're going to want to spend that money. And the goal is, or the idea is, that they're going to take that money and spend it somewhere. And so this is going to encourage businesses to start producing things and producing services, which in order to take the money that these workers want to spend. And of course, hopefully it will begin an upward spiral where once these corporations that want to take these workers' money, they need employees to, make or provide whatever services they're doing. So they're going to hire people, which means more money in the economy, more money in the hands of consumers. And when those more consumers spend that money, well, that means more businesses are going to open and hire more people to take that money from those consumers. And so it's an upward spiral. We're trying to reverse the downward spiral of the Depression by beginning to put money in the hands of consumers. Also, the National Recovery Administration was formed, setting forth an industrial code of conduct. Basically, one of the problems was that if you use true free market economies and free market capitalism in the midst of a depression, it's not going to help, because economies and companies are always trying to pay as little as possible and to make as much profit as possible. Well, this means kind of a race to the bottom, but we needed more money in consumers' hands. So laws were established to eliminate cutthroat competition, provide a stable wage for all workers across industries, and created labor peace, because at this time you have a lot of upset workers, especially members of unions, that don't have jobs. And when they do have jobs, they're not paying very well. So to try to eliminate this competition between corporations, they set forth basic standard labor requirements. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, their goal was raising farm prices. One of the problems during this time period was bumper crops. That doesn't sound like a problem, but it was. Basically, farmers were doing too well, and they were doing their job too well. Ranchers were doing their job too well. There was too much agriculture on the market. There was too much cattle and pork on the market for people to buy. Therefore, in order to get rid of it, they had to drop prices dramatically, prices to such extent that they didn't make a profit and were going under and weren't able to pay back their loans. So in order to reduce the amount of agriculture and ranch products in the market, the government paid ranchers and farmers to take land and animals out of production. And basically, they asked farmers to stop farming half their land because there was too much there. They needed to raise the farm prices. Now, you got to remember, we talked about this before, that the main, especially in the South, the main farming system or system of labor and agriculture was sharecropping, where basically the farmer would take half of his land. Let's say the farmer owns 100 acres. He would give half of that land, say 50 acres, to sharecropper and allow that sharecropper to farm that land. Okay? Allow that sharecropper to farm that land. And in payment for allowing that sharecropper to farm that land, he would get, the landowner would get half the crop or some percentage of the crop. Well, if the government's going to pay you to take land out of production, the first piece of land that they're going to take out of production, the landowner will, is land that they're not getting a full 100% profit from. That would be sharecroppers' land. So sharecroppers were the most harmed in this Agricultural Adjustment Act that took land out of production. Also, the government asked and encouraged farmers to kill their livestock because there was too much livestock on the market. Some of these acts in the or laws in the Agricultural Adjustment Act were declared unconstitutional, meaning that they went above and beyond what the Constitution, at least what the Supreme Court viewed the Constitution allowed them to do. But usually what they did is they went back and they rewrote the laws in order to address these unconstitutional parts and re-implemented the laws. Also, the Civilian Conservation Corps was established, basically employing young men to do whatever. I mean, it didn't matter if they were cleaning, streets or clearing forests or building bridges over rivers, highways, hospitals, schools. It didn't matter. They were just looking for ways to put people to work. So if you were a young man, usually between the age of, say, 17 and 25 or 30, and were capable of doing manual labor, you joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, and it put you to work. And so and then you were doing things that were beneficial to the greater society, like building roads, cleaning rivers, and building bridges and things like that. And it put money in their hands, and they in turn would spend that money, which would drive the economy. Also, the Works Progress Administration, instead of just regular labor, other people needed work too, older people, artists, things like that. So they found jobs in the Work Progress Administration for these type of people. Like, for instance, let's say you're a writer, and so the Works Progress Administration would pay you to write travel guides to the different areas of the country, and that encouraged people to work. People were working, making money, but also it encouraged people to travel once they had money to travel to different parts of the country. And so these early years were focusing on immediate problems, and then in 1935 they began to shift to more long-term, permanent economic reforms to address the problems of the Great Depression. Once again, there's a map of the Tennessee Valley, and those little red marks are where the dams were built for the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, FDR was popular, but he wasn't necessarily popular with everybody. There were certain segments of the population that didn't like what he was doing. Most logically was the more conservative people who thought the federal government was going way beyond what it was supposed to be doing. That it was moving towards, because it was starting to regulate the economy and dictating to businesses what and how they could produce. Many people saw creeping socialism or communism within Roosevelt's policies. And that was natural, but also there were those on the left or on the more liberal side that thought he didn't go far enough. That he thought they thought Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal should go much farther. One was a guy named Father Charles Coughlin, who was a priest, but he wasn't a very pleasant person. He was, and one of the people, and he had a radio show, and this is what made him kind of famous and influential as well. He had a radio show, and he basically placed the blame of the Great Depression, which was worldwide by this point. It wasn't just an American depression, it was a worldwide depression. He placed the blame on Jewish bankers, basically. That stereotype that is very common and throughout history on Jewish bankers. He was very anti-Semitic and was very clear in his blaming of Jews for the problems. And in order to fix the problems, he wanted to basically nationalize the banks. While Roosevelt did put some regulations on the banks were still private enterprises. were for-profit and were owned by private individuals. And but he wanted to nationalize the banks, which means that just have the government take them over and run them for the benefit of the country. This was even too far for Roosevelt to go and his supporters. He wanted to maintain, Roosevelt wanted to maintain the capitalist system, only he wanted it to be somewhat regulated in order to be less likely to fail. So he wanted regulation, but he did not want to nationalize the banks. Now, Francis Townsend was another opponent of Roosevelt who thought he didn't go far enough. Early on, especially later on, Roosevelt will take Townsend's ideas and convert them, and they'll be the basis for what will be the Social Security program. But early on, he was calling for a $200 annual pension for old people, because one of the problems during this time was that once you got too old to work, and maybe you didn't have a family to take care of you, there was no such thing as Social Security. There wasn't anything such thing as Medicare, and so you were just stuck. You could potentially be homeless just because you got old. And this was happening to a lot of people during the Great Depression. A lot of older people had nowhere to go and were simply homeless. So he called for a $200 pension for old people or elderly. Huey Long, who was a politician in Louisiana, was probably one of the more radical people. His program he promoted was called the Share the Wealth program. He believed the biggest problem was that too few people had too much money. He said there could be more money in the system if some people just didn't have all of it. And he would point to people like the Rockefellers or the Carnegies or Henry Ford. So he wanted an extreme redistribution of wealth and limits on income. He argued that I don't know if this is exactly right, but I want to say that he argued that anybody that made over $1 million a year, that everything above that should be taxed 100%, that all of it should be taken and redistributed to those that needed it, to the poor, to the indigent. And this was a very, very radical idea that came very close to pushing towards, extreme socialism and possibly communism. But he was very popular, and he was a very powerful, influential politician. And so he was seen as a danger. And eventually I believe he was assassinated. Also, the Supreme Court was a challenge to Roosevelt. Many of his policies were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which is the role of the Supreme Court, to declare the constitutionality of laws. And this greatly frustrated Roosevelt. So now in the Constitution, one of the powers of Congress is to determine and change, if they want to, the number of people on the Supreme Court. And of course, the Supreme Court, they only have to, by majority rule, overturn a law. So there were 9 members of the Supreme Court. And so it only took 5 of them to declare an act of the New Deal unconstitutional. Well, since Congress, which was dominated by Democrats, which supported Roosevelt, excuse me, since they could change the size of the Supreme Court, Roosevelt secretly plotted to get with the Democrats in Congress to expand the court to either 13 or 15. And of course, the president has the power to appoint Supreme Court members. So, of course, these new members of the Supreme Court would be appointed by him, which, of course, they would support his policies, which in turn would give him a secure majority on the Supreme Court, and no more of his New Deal policies would be declared unconstitutional. This was done in secret because it was very anti-constitution. And once it leaked out that this was what was happening, there was such outrage, including from his own party, that he had to give up the court packing. Now, one of the most important things that was established during Roosevelt's presidency, at least during the New Deal, at least to Roosevelt, Roosevelt called this his most important achievement of the New Deal, was the establishment of the Social Security Administration. And Social Security, basically it was a safety net for Americans, especially poor and older Americans. And it allowed that if you if you lost your job through no fault of your own, that there would be something called unemployment insurance. That would be a bridge until you got a job. Also, old age insurance, kind of going back to that Francis Townsend idea, where taxpayers would pay in, all workers would pay in just a little bit, and allow people that got to a certain age to collect Social Security. And it was like paying it forward. And as you work throughout your life, according to the Social Security system, you would pay in a little bit, and then once you to kind of fund the retirement or the old age of some of these older people. And in return, when you retire, get to retirement age and can't work anymore, everybody else that's working would be paying in to support you. The problem is, well, it's not a problem at the time, but when this was established, and this is a current problem that we have today, but when this system was established, the Social Security Administration was established, for every one retiree or one person collecting Social Security, there were anywhere from 10 to 12 people working, paying into the system. So if everybody was paying in it, all they had to do was pay in just a little bit. But because of the number of retirees currently retiring and those that will retire in the near future, the baby boomer generation, pretty soon the ratio will be for every one person collecting Social Security, there will be only two people working. And so that's a problem, because that means either the retiree is going to have to take less, or the worker is going to have to pay more. And so that's a problem that we're going to have to address as a society. Labor legislation of the New Deal, the Wagner Act, allowed union organization. Many states had passed laws that limited or even made it criminal for unions to organize, and allowed companies to fire people just because they were part of a union, or even if they just threatened to join a union, they could be fired. This Wagner Act made it legal and made it illegal to stop union organization, and made it legal for unions to negotiate for better wages. And of course, the goal was to increase wages, and it worked. It outlawed unfair labor practices. And then, of course, Fair Labor Standards was passed in 1938, which included minimum wages and maximum hours for many workers, including industrial workers. Although we'll talk about in a minute, these minimum wages and maximum hours did not apply to agricultural workers and domestic workers like maids and butlers and things like that. So the impact of the New Deal, all these policies that were put into place to help pull us out of the Great Depression, to help establish regulations on businesses, it helped labor and businesses the most. Okay, because the goal was to put people to work and to get businesses hiring. So both of them benefited from this. Union membership increases, which means higher wages and better benefits. Wages and working conditions improve, which begin the seeds of the middle class. By the 1940s, and especially in the 1950s, union members were middle class. You didn't have to have a college education, but you made enough because of the wages that were negotiated to have a middle class life, to buy a house, to send your kids to college, to do these, have an automobile, to do these things, and so it created the middle class. Also, it subsidized business activity, helping businesses, giving them low interest loans, giving them special treatment in order to allow them to survive. Now, it helped women and minorities the least. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which, remember, took land out of production, mostly white farmers evicting black sharecroppers and tenant farmers. So, you get rid of the people that were working half your land if you're going to take that land out of production, and you continue to farm your half of your land. So that's generally what happened. The WPA, the Work Progress Administration, some of the problems there was that it was segregated. And in some cases, black segregated groups in the Work Progress Administration were paid less than white workers. wage laws did not apply to domestic and agricultural labor. We talked about that. And of course, mainly those jobs were held by minorities and women. And it was and really it was a demand of the Southern Democrats. In order to get this New Deal passed in Congress, the Southern Democrats demanded that the majority of their workers, which were domestic and agricultural, that these minimum wages did not apply to them. And of course, as the New Deal wound down and the government started pulling back and spending less money hiring people, women lost the jobs faster than men. Now, with all this going on, the first few years of the presidency, you have your election of 1936. And it's a referendum on the New Deal, which means it's basically an election on whether to continue the New Deal or not. That's what a referendum means. And Roosevelt wins an easy victory over Alfred Landon. And in this election, the coalition that elects him will be a coalition that will support and keep Democrats in power, especially in Congress, for about the next 40 years. And that will be Southerners, people living in cities, which are mainly a lot of immigrants and labor, of course, labor and ethnic groups, African Americans, and anybody who's poor supported this because the New Deal and Roosevelt specifically were seen as empathizing and helping the poor with their policies. And if you look at the vote down there, it's just a landslide over Alfred Landon, almost 28 million to just a little under 17 million in the electoral vote, which really officially determines who the winner is, 523 to 8. It's one of the most lopsided victories in election history, presidential election history. Now, the New Deal in decline. Over time, once it got its footing, as we saw that unemployment chart, where unemployment started declining, people were going back to work. Many in Congress said we need to stop spending so much money. We need to let the free market take over again. So by 1936, Congress began cutting money for relief agencies. Okay, less money going to the Works Progress Administration, less money going to the Civilian Conservation Corps and things like that. And when that happened, well, as you can imagine, there's less money going out to hire people. That means these companies start laying off people again, and there's fewer workers, a spike in unemployment, and so a severe recession hits. I should say severe, S-E-V-E-R-E, not sever, but I apologize for the typo. A severe recession hits. Not a depression. It wasn't as bad as the original depression, but it was an economic downturn. Roosevelt gets blamed for it by the public, and the public demands him to do something about it, and so he begins more spending. And Congress, with pressure on them, begins to spend more. And once again, if you look at the unemployment rates after that, they begin to drop a little bit. And of course, also, 1936, 1937 is the beginning of the war rumblings in Europe for World War II. And by 1938, Republicans who had been outcasts because of the kind of the stink of Herbert Hoover, and the popularity of Franklin Roosevelt, they begin to rise from the depths and begin to have a little more say in policy and in rolling back the New Deal. So the New Deal in American life, the New Deal limitations. The Depression was not ended, as I mentioned. The Depression did not end because of the New Deal. What the New Deal did was stop the downward spiral. It leveled off the economy. It stopped the dip in the economy. It stopped the decreases in unemployment. There was still high unemployment, but it wasn't continuing to get higher and higher. And as we mentioned earlier, there was little improvement in the lives of minorities and women. Those were the ones that were mainly left out of the benefits of the New Deal. The New Deal achievements, though, the Social Security Act. Roosevelt himself said it was the thing he is most proud of as far as the New Deal and policies implemented during the New Deal. The fact that he is able to implement a policy that protected older people. The Wagner Act was successful as it created a viable middle class by allowing unions to organize. Of course, today unions are seen as bad, across many swaths of society, and the government actually discourages union organization because of their pro-business attitudes. And of course, along with that, which some people don't know this, that our middle class is shrinking because, not in part because, not all because, but in part because of the shrinking union membership in our economy. Also, one of the important things that Roosevelt did with the New Deal and that the New Deal accomplished was regulating the economy but maintaining a capitalist system. Many critics of the New Deal argued that it was a slippery slope going from these policies to socialism and then eventually to communism. Because remember, communism was becoming a very popular alternative during the Great Depression throughout the world, and even in sections of the United States. But the New Deal was able to maintain the capitalist system, but implementing regulations that helped protect workers and protect the economy itself. It created a socially responsive government. It implemented permanently that progressive idea that the government, the federal government, because of the size of the country now and the population and the complexity of the country, that the federal government should respond to problems actively. Whereas prior to that, except for the progressive era, the idea was that government should leave it to the local governments and state governments. And then it created a fundamental political alignment that lasted for about 40 years. And it was that coalition we talked about before that supported the Roosevelt's New Deal, supported the Democrats, and it's a very weird marriage between the liberal Northern Democrats led by Roosevelt, who wanted these economic changes, and the very conservative Southern Democrats, who allowed these economic policies to be passed as long as they could maintain their segregated society. They would continue as long as their segregation and their system of society and government wasn't threatened. They would support these New Deal policies and support the Democrats on the national level. But as we're going to find out later in this semester, once the Democrats began embracing civil rights, the Southern Democrats moved away and began, starting in the 1970s and the early 1980s, becoming more aligned with the Republican